Hello everyone, I'm Rajesh Gupta and we are continuing our discussion on the new colonial media. So we have already started talking about the Kalighat paintings and this use of British watercolor on this mill-made newsprint paper and what different kind of visual presence it yields for this newness. So what we have on screen, there are two different themes, and in the Kalighat paintings what we have that predominantly there are the devotional themes we find, but it's not necessarily that those are all Hindu devotional themes. So for example, here in the left side of the screen we see a tajia, and that is this elaborately decorated portable tableaus which are taken out during the Muharram procession. And then here we have this image of a burak, this composite human and animal form, and on the top of that we have this architectural form here, which is a symbolic representation of the like the martyrs of Karbala. So this is something that we find that in the Kalighat paintings, it is this kind of images can either be used as souvenir items. It can also be used for for devotion, for keeping them at home, and for whatever religious purposes. Now the other image that we have on the other side of the screen, there we see Gaud Nitai, these two celebrated Vaishnavite saints from early modern Bengal, and then they have played a very important role in the spread of Vaishnavism in Bengal. So there are certain themes that those are very specific to the Bengali speaking people or this region, and then how we also see that that there are themes which might also go beyond this particular regional like the forms of devotion. So this is another example of the Kalighat painting, and this is perhaps this is made in the late 19th century, around 1875, and here we see this episode of Mohanto and Elokeshi. So we have already discussed this scandal of the 19th century Bengal, that is about Mohanto and Elokeshi, and here we see how these two figures are painted into by the Kalighat painters. So here what we have that this image is perhaps, again we can see that there are like the additional blobs of color, and some of the places the lines will be extended out of the contour lines, and then like in parts of the places, in places we also see how the color of the body and the other attire, they would also extend beyond the contour lines of the body. However, so those kind of swiftness we find in this one, but we can also see how this image is much more refined from some of the other images that we have seen earlier. Now in this one we also see this particular tendency of giving modulation to the body, and that is the reason how these bodies, they look round in shape. Now this modulation of the body, people have also suggested that how the idol makers who were well versed in making the 3D models or the idols of the gods and goddesses, so that's the reason they already had a tendency of making this the 3D structures of the bodies, and that is something that is reflected in in the making of these figures as well, where this 3D modulation is given. And so this is something that we that is it's a possibility. However, one cannot deny that this kind of modulation is also something that had been possible because of the particular use of color. This watercolor made this kind of modulation possible, of course with the artisan's intervention. And as I have already mentioned, that how this particular episode in the 19th century Calcutta had gained momentum, and for all wrong reasons. So that is the reason this particular this theme was addressed by many people, the painters of Kalighat, at the same time the printers and woodblock carvers of Bottala, and all of them have responded to the story of Mohanto and Elokeshi. So from there I'll move on to the next segment of our discussion, and that is to do with the oil painting. Now, if, like when we spoke about the new colonial media for painting, so in by that media I have meant that one is the watercolor, this British watercolor, its characteristic feature, why it was a very important one, and then what different kind of like the approaches it had presented. Now here we find that there is this other painting medium, that is oil painting, and why oil painting was also something that is new. So in the Indian subcontinent we have images, I mean we have the images which are made in opaque watercolor, but not really oil based color. So here, for that reason, we find that after its invention, oil painting had been profusely incorporated in artistic practices in various parts of Western and Northern Europe. And then we see that how the oil painting had also had its importance because of its lifelike quality, or certain things which are almost brought to life by the use of oil colors. So that is the reason this particular tendency of the colonial rulers and also the Western Europeans towards this evidence like visuals. So the oil painting definitely satisfies that, and that's the reason we find that oil painting had its importance for depiction of this kind of themes. Now this is one image that, I mean, it's not necessarily made by the Indian painters, or not specifically for for South Asia or the Indian subcontinent, but this is an image which shows something, it gives a message, and that's the reason I wanted to share this. Now what do we have in this image? So this image, we see that it is almost like, I mean, the viewer can see that there is this seafaring that is happening, there is this ocean, and where there is a where is this ship at the center of this image, and then in this oval frame, in this there are two figures who are in conversation with each other, and this two figure, one is Britannia, and that is the she is the symbol of Britain. So she is here, she is all white, she is also clad in this white drapery and with like white pearls and everything, and then she sits on the cloud or on a high ground, and then there is this lion, which is the British lion, representation of the British lion. And so then she is in conversation with this very dark skinned woman, and the dark skinned woman represents the East. So this painting does not really specify that, I mean, whether by East it means like South Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East, or anything else, but in general it's sort of like, I mean, represent East. And then what we see here is this woman, this dark skinned woman is she has her upper body uncovered, and she only wears drapery in the lower part of her body, something that is also associated with being uncivilized. And then this dark skinned woman willingly gives all her riches to Britannia. So we see that, I mean, the dark skinned woman, she holds this plate full of riches. So there we see like the ornaments and different kind of pearls and like the precious jewels and everything, and she gives them, or like, I mean, she willingly offers them to Britannia, almost in a form that she knows that if those things are given to Britannia, then she will be safe, or all those things will be in safe hand. So this image, if we see this image, if we see all the anatomical details of this central characters, all the other characters around them, and then also like the way the sea has been shown, the way the clouds in the sky they have been shown, they have the lifelike quality, and oil painting also contributes to that. It adds to this lifelike quality, and this superb modulation of the skin and anatomy, all those things can be done. So that is how what happens is that we see that how this almost looks like an image which is believable, or something that actually took place in in reality. So now we also have like so in other words I can say that what we see here is this this constructed reality through which a message, a very important message is conveyed, that the British colonizers, they did not take over the various parts of Asia or the so-called East, but the people there, they willingly offered their land and the riches to the British, to the colonizers, because they know that is the only way to be civilized, that is the only way they will have protection and safety and everything else. So why this medium of oil painting here is very important is this is a constructed reality, and the colonizers know about it, but an image like that which takes minute references from the study of the anatomy, from all the other different kind of details, setting up this stage like form and having this entire scene being performed. So these things add to constructing this imagined reality, and that is something that that also added to their justification of taking over the lands of various parts of Asia, parts of Africa, and so on. So this is the reason, as I have said, that the oil painting has that lifelike quality, and this image is made in 1778, that is in the late 18th century, much before the advent of photography. So this kind of make-believe images can be used to show the people that what the reality is, whereas we all know that this is a constructed reality, this is not the actual reality, but the language of the painting, this visual language, makes it believable, makes it very close to the life. So taking this thing, we also see that there are certain the European painters, they have traveled. So for example, we see like the William and Thomas Daniel, so they are the ones, and then like also another painter would be Tilly. So there are many of those painters who would be traveling with the colonial administrators, and sometimes they have worked for the East India Company. Sometimes we also see that after their performance, some of the princely states would invite them to have their European style portraits painted. So that kind of activity we would find, and then this particular image that we see, even though this is painted as in watercolor, and it is actually an unknown painter who had painted it. But what is interesting in this image is this: we find that the painter Tilly is caught in this, in the process of painting this particular image. So what we see here is that Tilly is seated here in the with this canvas, and then he is painting this image of Shujauddaulah. So Shujauddaulah was this ruler of Awadh or Lucknow, and then this is an image that we find that in the early 19th century. So in the early 19th century, as we know, that Tilly had arrived in this Awadhi court, and then he also made a portrait of Shujauddaulah. But what we have here in this image is the making of that painting. So this image, what we have, that Shujauddaulah with his 10 sons, and then also like I mean we have the architectural reference of the palace complex there. Now we also see that I mean this in this particular image, that how the painter, that is presumably Tilly, and he does not look to the image, to the canvas he is painting, but he sort of like I mean looks to the viewers, almost like I mean as a conscious gesture that he is attesting his own identity into this image. Now the thing is that I mean this image had also been discussed by art historian Natasha Eaton, and she had looked into the mimetic qualities of this image, and we know that I mean how this kind of like I mean the images of the portraits of the colonial rulers that started this large scale oil painting portraits, they started being used as gifts. So how the rulers would give those painted portraits of themselves to the other people, and then those images would stay in these different palaces or in these offices as a symbolic presence of those particular those influential figures. So in a way those oil painted portraits became a kind of a presence in their absence. So that is how like I mean the paintings, even though those were given as gifts, they had this high political value, and that is the reason the mimetic the power in these images are something that goes beyond its visual appreciation. So in those grounds we find that I mean the Indian the princely states, the elites from the Indian princely states, the royals, they also started commissioning this kind of portraits, and in the fashion of the European rulers and the administrators. And there is one example of that. So here we have another portrait made by Tilly, and this is Muhammad Ali Khan, and he was the Nawab of Arcot in Tamil Nadu. So this is also an image which was painted in the 1770s, so late 18th century, and in these lives it's a large scale portrait painting. And in this one what we find that the Nawab, he stands in this in this open perhaps in an open terrace like space where the light falls on him, and then this image is also sort of framed by this thick pillar, and there is this curtain which is drawn. So this drawn curtain, something that is a motif, and that is something that I have already discussed in the earlier lecture, that how that was also a colonial strategy we find that is employed in painting the portraits. So that the similar kind of thing we would find in many of the portraits which were produced in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this drawn curtain and the a dark column like this, that would almost like I mean suggest that the curtain is now drawn, and then the viewers have an access to the world through this window. So the window is the painting, and then like the curtains are drawn, and then one can have access to this like I mean to this world there. And what we also see here is this, how this particular image of Muhammad Ali Khan is painted, and then usually the sitters, like I mean this royals would stand there or would give them multiple sitting for painting these portraits. And here we find that I mean all the details of the images have been executed. So for example, we have how the surface of the fabric is like this white jama is made differently from this velvet jacket. And then also like I mean how this is also different from the pearls, or like I mean the other jewels, or the the sword that he holds in his hand. So oil painting that gives this opportunity to experiment with this different kind of surface making. And since Now this is a painting technique which is done in layers. So different kind of, like, I mean, you know, this kind of surfaces can be built over time, and you know, like, if there are mistakes, if there are things that need to be changed, that can also be done, which is not possible in the watercolor technique. This is another image by Tilly, and what we have, that, I mean, sometimes, as I have already mentioned, that these images would serve as documentation of important historical events, political relations, and of course the portraits of these important figures. So in this image, what we find here is this, how this particular event is unfolding. Now this is something that was in this one we find the Tesu Lama, and he is giving the, he is addressing the people here. Now this is perhaps the first audience of the first British embassy in to Tibet. So, and that happened in around in the 1770s. So when it happened, then Tilly himself was not presented there. I mean, he was not present there. Then he heard this the description of the entire event from George Bogle, and then George Bogle, we can see him as, you know, like, I mean, we see him in this image. He is stood here. So he is, like, I mean, clad in this you know, in this Tibetan costume, but, like, I mean, we can also mark him to be different from the other figures that we have around. So what we have here is this first audience of the first British embassy to Tibet in the 1770s, and during this time we see that Teshu Lama, and he's seated here in this you know, like, I mean, in this seat, and then there are you know, these thankas which are displayed onto the wall, and then again there is this window in the background through which then the curtains are drawn so that one can see parts of the mountain, as well as, like, I mean, you know, this historic palace complex in Lhasa. So what we have here in this image is that, again, that this is supposed to show the reality, and you know, it's supposed to stand as this evidential, supposed to stand as this evidential document of the first British you know, the first audience of the first British embassy to Tibet. However, as I have already mentioned, that, I mean, the painter himself was not present, I mean, there, but then, like, he had heard the entire description of this place from George Bogle, who's present in this image, and then it kind of, like, I mean, through the attestation of George Bogle, one can you know, the authenticity of this image was established. So in a way, that, I mean, even though these images are considered as the evidential proof, but there are all these layers involved, that the painter was not present there, but still, like, I mean, you know, how through George Bogle the authenticity of this painting was established. Now by that, what I mean is that, I mean, this authenticity of the painting is also established by the language of oil painting, because if oil painting is this particular medium of expression was not employed, if this particular image was you know, like, I mean, made in, like, the Kalighat paintings, then it might have created a very different kind of reaction from the audience. You know, like, I mean, a sketch like image or a hand drawn image would always yield a very different kind of response from the audience than what happens when we have this carefully constructed you know, the paintings in oil painting, right? So those are the kind of things that you know, make the oil painting different from many other forms of expression, that also, like, I mean, as I have mentioned, that, I mean, that adds to the you know, like, the believability of this kind of images, and how that is also used for constructing reality. I'm not saying representing reality, but they construct reality. The other important part of the oil painting technique that we find that in most cases when we are talking about watercolor, we keep the image, we keep the paper on the horizontal level, and then we paint onto it. And since there are water based ink that can drip, and that's the reason, like, I mean, usually that is kept on the horizontal level or slightly in this diagonal level, and then it is painted. However, what happens in the oil painting, we find that easel is used. So for example, in this image we have the part of the wooden easel that is there, and that sort of, like, I mean, supports the canvas. And the canvas is, unlike the paper, canvas is something that is placed almost vertically in front of the artist, and the artist can paint onto that. So this is a very different approach from how the paintings are made. So as opposed to like how the horizontally we do the painting, and here we do it vertically. And that is also one of the reason in which we find that, I mean, when the sitters are there, we see them right, like, I mean, in front of us, and then there is a canvas which is also placed vertically. So how, like, I mean, the sitter or the object which the painters try to paint, that is then exactly replicated onto the canvas, or at least, like, I mean, that is what it is claimed. So these are the reasons, like, I mean, the technique of making these paintings become very different. It's a new kind of intervention into the existing visual culture in the Indian subcontinent. And that is the reason what we find that, I mean, during this time period, the wealthy Indians, like the royals, they would prefer to have their portraits painted. And it's not just the royals. In the later times we also find like the zamindars, and then, like, I mean, the important traders and so on, they would also commission this kind of images to be made. Now that said, we also find that, I mean, how that also made a way for like, I mean, training the next generation of painters who would not always be from the European background but from the South Asian background. We'll get more into that in the next lecture. Thank you.